My name is David King. I was the MLA who steered the Sexual Sterilization Repeal Act through the legislature in 1972. I've spent most of my life in Alberta, from the age of 2 until the age of 65. Okay. My father was a United Church minister. When he graduated from theology school at McGill University, the church sent him to the United Church in Cardston, Alberta. So I arrived with my parents at the age of 2 in Cardston, lived for 3 years in Cardston, 3 years in Lethbridge, and then virtually all the rest of my life has been lived in Edmonton, except for these last 3 here in Victoria. I had a very interesting upbringing, and one that appeals to me. I'm the one who lived it. My father was a United Church minister. My grandfather was a United Church minister. I have aunts and uncles and cousins who are United Church ministers. And what was common to all of them, and certainly held with great conviction by my father and my grandfather, was the idea of the social gospel. I can remember being told as a very young child that we are partners with God in the act of creation, and that the role of an individual Christian or of the Christian church is to be out in the world trying to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. My grandfather ran for the CCF in New Brunswick. My father worked his way through 3 years of university working as an organizer for the CCF. So I just grew up believing that religion and politics were very important, and that your religious conviction had to be expressed in your life as a citizen. Oh yes, I would say that our family circumstances were comfortable. My father was blessed to be in churches where there were thriving communities and thriving congregations in thriving communities. He was always in the company of people who were very, very active in the community and cared about the community. My father served on any number of community boards, and he was always rubbing shoulders with and bringing people home who also served on community boards and were active in the life of the community. I took most of my schooling in Edmonton, graduated from East Glen High School in Edmonton in 1964, took my first year of university at the University of Victoria, came back to Edmonton to the University of Alberta, and in 1967, when Peter Lougheed was elected Leader of the Opposition, I went to work for him in the Legislative Assembly. I worked for Peter for 2 years in the Legislative Assembly, during which time I married. In '69, I went back to university, and in '71, I was elected to the Legislative Assembly. The University of Alberta in the mid-'60s was a wonderful place to get an education. In terms of enrollment, it was a lot smaller than it was now. I can remember walking around the campus and running into Walter Johns, who was then the president of the university, and Walter Johns knew me by name and would stop to say hello to me, ask me how things were going. The university was in a smaller city. Edmonton was much smaller then than it is now. And in terms of all the foment that was occurring in universities around the world, we knew it was happening. We engaged in it a little bit at the University of Alberta. We had a chapter of the Students for a Democratic Society. I marched across the high-level bridge to protest higher tuition fees. But it was nothing like Columbia University or the University of California at Berkeley or some of the other universities that were challenged at that time. I studied political science and history at university. and enjoyed the courses, enjoyed the professors. It's very interesting that there was a lot that I experienced later in life as an MLA, as a cabinet minister, and as a citizen that was just not part of the coursework that I did at university. We're talking about eugenics and the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta. I heard nothing about those things when I was at the University of Alberta. Didn't know about them until I went to work for Peter Lougheed. One of Peter's primary interests was in human rights. In '69, halfway through his term as leader of the opposition, he told the world that when the Conservatives formed the government, they would introduce a provincial Bill of Rights. And in the context of being concerned about human rights and making the declaration that the government would introduce a Bill of Rights, he asked me to look at all legislation that was on the books and identify for his attention the legislation that would be problematic in the light of a Bill of Rights. He was also working with interested provincial associations. I can remember him doing a lot of work with the Canadian Mental Health Association because the Blair report was in process at that time, was to come out just before the '71 election, if I remember correctly. And what was that report? The Blair report on mental health programming and law in Alberta. It had been, it was a report for the provincial government. Dr. Blair was commissioned by the provincial government of the day, but I think it's fair to say that it was in response to concerns that had been raised by the Alberta chapter of the Canadian Mental Health Association about the condition in our mental health hospitals and services for the mentally ill. So I remember Peter being very concerned about putting forward this Bill of Rights. I remember him being concerned that we should audit all provincial legislation in place at that time to identify those that would be problematic in the light of a Bill of Rights. I remember him working with a number of provincial organizations. The one I remember best is the Canadian Mental Health Association, but he was working with others. There's an awful lot that I could say about Lougheed. I think I learned an incredible amount from him and wish that I had learned more. On one level, you would say that he was intelligent, very self-disciplined, very well organized. He was also not ideological. He was very pragmatic. And I think that reflected his conviction that politics was about people. And you simply cannot go into politics with a view to making the people fit the rules or the institutions or the whatever. Peter's view was that the law and the government had to adapt to the needs and the aspirations of the people. So in addition to being intelligent, very well organized and self-disciplined, he was also very concerned about people, community, human rights. There was a reason why the Individual Rights Protection Act and the Bill of Rights were the first two pieces of legislation that a Conservative government dealt with after forming the government in 1971. The first time I became aware of sexual sterilization or eugenics was when I found that piece of legislation on the books in Alberta. As I say, in direct response to a request that Peter Lougheed had made to me that I should go through all of the then operative provincial legislation. When I read it, I was, first of all, astonished, and secondly, I was horrified. I was born in 1946. I was born after the Second World War. what I understood about eugenics, I understood in the context of Nazi Germany. And to see that we had that kind of legislation on the books in Alberta, to see that there was still a board, to see that sexual sterilization was still occurring in Alberta, I mean, it was shocking to me, just shocking. And I think it was shocking to Peter. No, he didn't know. He didn't know about it until I brought it to his attention as part of this review I was doing at his direction. In the summer of 1971, we formed the government, and historically in Alberta there had not been full sittings of the Legislative Assembly at that time. We were replacing a government that had been in office for 36 years. We needed time. We needed to get a cabinet in place, develop some culture in our caucus. We needed to organize. We needed to look at the books. There were all kinds of things we needed to do. And so it was entirely reasonable in the circumstances that we weren't going to have a session until the spring of 1972. And the Premier had already said that two bills, the Individual Rights Protection Act and the Human Rights Act, were going to be the first two pieces of legislation introduced at the spring sitting of the Legislative Assembly. But he wanted other things done as well that were commensurate with this concern he had for human rights. And one of them was the immediate repeal of the Sexual Sterilization Act. One of Peter's initiatives was that he wanted backbench MLAs to introduce some important government legislation that would be taken forward on behalf of the government. And partly because of my interest in the Act, and partly out of his interest to promote this new role for backbench MLAs, he asked me if I would take the Sexual Sterilization Repeal Act through the legislature, which I was delighted to do. And as I say, you can look at that in the light of the Individual Rights Protection Act, the Human Rights Act. Also in 1972, we established a committee that ultimately recommended repeal of the Communal Property Act, which had limited the place of Hutterites in the Alberta community. So there were a lot of things done in the spring of 1972 that were meant to address what some people might call a deficit. In terms of the Sexual Sterilization Act, it was worse than a deficit. It wasn't a hole, it was an ugly mountain. The general response of the caucus was just as much surprise and horror when they became aware of the legislation as had been Peter's response or my response. And in caucus and generally, there was widespread support. There was some opposition to it. I don't remember that any outright opposition was expressed in the legislature, but there were some MLAs who spoke the kinds of cautions that suggested in a different forum they might have taken a different position. And although I don't remember the detail of it, I do remember some parents writing to us. When I say some, it was very, very few, to say that they were appreciative that a child had been sterilized because they were concerned about what would have been the life of that child otherwise. Generally speaking, across the province as a whole, there was great support for it. In caucus, there was support for it, both in the Legislative Assembly and in a few individual cases, there were expressions of caution or opposition. I don't recall having had any contact with the people who were inside the system. I don't recall having had any contact with people from Michener Centre or the Eugenics Board. There might have been such contact with other MLAs, perhaps with the Minister of Health or with the Premier, but there was not with me. I didn't meet the chair of the board. I didn't meet any other members of the board at that time, and nor since. I don't think the general public was at all aware that the Eugenics Board was operating or that the legislation was in place. The response that we got to the introduction of the bill was generally, first of all, surprise and then horror. There was nobody who said, "I've known about this and I'm thankful that you are doing it." Among the media, among the general public, there seemed to be almost universal surprise. Now, that couldn't have been entirely the case. There were members of the Eugenics Board. There were people at the institutions who were conducting the operations. There were parents. So it can't have been entirely the case, but my memory of the media coverage and of the general response of the population was overwhelmingly surprise. The terrible thing about the legislation was that it presumed to make a moral judgment about individuals, and secondly, that it appeared to equate science possibility, science capacity, with morality. You know, it was a little bit like saying, why do you climb Mount Everest? Because it is there. This was saying, why do you sterilize people? Because we can sterilize people. We claim to have good reason for doing it, okay, but it can be done and we're doing it. So I was horrified by the idea that you were going to make this legislative representation of morality in this way, okay? And secondly, that it appeared that you were equating technology and science with morality. Okay? I never really inquired about the operations of the Eugenics Board, because to me the problem was not a technical problem. The problem was not, are they sterilizing some people under the wrong conditions, and if we tightened up the guidelines, would that make it acceptable? The operation of the Eugenics Board, in my view, was abhorrent. And that was in law, not in the operation. I think there's a real problem in trying to skirt certain issues. I think there's a real problem in asking the question, what if instead of repealing the Sexual Sterilization Act, instead of invoking a Sexual Sterilization Act, we had an act about who may marry and who may not marry. That's a personal response, and other citizens might make a different response. But to me, the way, the occasions on which the state intervenes in the life of individuals is just something that we have to be very, very cautious about. And I would treat a prohibition against marriage in some circumstances as being quite like a Sexual Sterilization Act. I can remember my first meeting with a victim of the act very clearly. His name was Ken Nelson, and he came into my office in the legislature sometime while we were in process of dealing with the legislation, that is before the 2nd of June 1972. And Ken was in moments ecstatic and in moments outraged. I can remember that first meeting very clearly. And Ken and I kept in touch for years and years after that. What it did was personalize my conviction that the legislation was wrong. When you introduce legislation, I can read the legislation and say that I am surprised and outraged by it. I can draft the repeal legislation and take it into the Legislative Assembly. That's operating at one level. When somebody walks into your door and sits down with you and has a cup of coffee with you and talks about what life was like and what kind of a judgment was being visited on Ken when this was done, and how that affected his self-concept or his life thereafter. And repealing the legislation in 1972 didn't repair all of the wounds that had been inflicted on Ken, not only as a direct result, okay, but also as indirect and marginal results of this. What it did was personalize something that until that moment in time was very important to me intellectually or morally, but my meeting Ken, my meeting Leilani subsequently, I mean, these things personalize it. I think that the Sexual Sterilization Act is one of many, many examples of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. There were giants in Canadian history who were supporters of sexual sterilization. You know, people who otherwise did some wonderful things in the province or in the country. And we need to be mindful of the fact that no matter you are largely on a trajectory of good, right, you can do some things on the margins that you haven't given enough thought to, that you haven't interacted with other people enough on, okay? And they can be very damaging. But I do believe that the road to hell is sometimes paved with good intentions. And here we had a situation of people advocating for legislation that they argued was ultimately going to end poverty. Okay? It was going to end stress on families. Okay? It was going to reduce costs to government. It was going to result in a better world. Okay? It was just one more stepping stone on the road to the New Jerusalem. Okay? It wasn't. Okay? It was hell. You know, we sometimes say that the end justifies the means. We seem to have a choice. You can say on the one hand, the end justifies the means, or on the other hand, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Generally speaking, we misunderstand that term, the end justifies the means. We tend to think about the end and say, for a good end, you can do anything that is necessary to achieve that good end. What the statement originally meant was that the merit of the end adds merit to the means that you use. Okay? That if the end is important, then the means themselves are meritorious. Okay? That's not true. Okay? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the end does not justify the means. The end does not lend merit to an otherwise bad means. There are two that are equally tragic, and in a sense they're quite different, although in a sense they're related. One is a macro tragedy and one is a micro tragedy. Okay? The micro tragedy is in the lives of individuals. Okay? It's in the lives of individuals who are sterilized, wrongly or not. Okay? It's in the lives of people on the Eugenics Board who were playing a role that I think had to be a deadening role for them. So there's a tragedy in terms of the individuals who are involved. There's also a tragedy in terms of public policy and the life of the community. Okay? It is a mistake to believe that there are technical answers to human situations, human needs, and it is a mistake to equate scientific or technological capability, okay, with the needs of humanity in a community. Okay? So to me, it was a tragedy both at the macro level in terms of it being bad policy and bad for the community and bad for our sense of how we relate to each other and how we are responsible to each other. And it's a tragedy at the individual level. It does affect family. It affects the family in any number of ways. And again, it raises the question about whether or not in a community all of our responses can be or should be restricted to institutional responses, or do we make responses that are entirely different from the bureaucratic or the institutional, and for lack of a better term, I'll call them human responses. And communities are challenged with this in any number of ways. If we limit ourselves for this conversation to the people who have been sexually sterilized or who might be candidates for sexual sterilization, people with intellectual challenges or people with mental health issues, are we saying that we are incapable of providing support systems for them and their family, except in some institutional and bureaucratic way? I think it's a sad thing to concede that. I know people who were sexually sterilized who were every bit as capable of being loving parents and effective parents, okay, as my wife and I, or anybody else that I know. I know people for whom that might have been something of a challenge, but with support systems, it would have been entirely possible. And I know people for whom it would have been extremely difficult and might not have been possible, but I would still say that we could have found a different way through that challenge than the one we chose. I think that the lives of successors, the lives of successors in any problematic situation are always better when we have adopted one more partial resolution to the problem. But it's a mistake to think that in any situation a group of people is challenged by only one problem and that solving that problem is the resolution of all of their issues. So if we're talking about people who are intellectually challenged or have mental health problems, I would say that their life now is better for the Act of '72 and for Leilani's challenge and for the experience with Bill 26 in 1998, but it would be very foolish to say that any of those things were the critical turning point that turned them away from any significant challenge hereafter and set them on the course to, a nothing but pleasant life. I was very happy to see Leilani challenge the government for its responsibility in her situation. And this is something we need to remember with respect to natives, Indigenous peoples in Canada, or the Japanese, or the Ukrainians, or the Italians. Leilani was right to do what she did, and her success was an affirmation for her as well as for others, including others in entirely different circumstances. Her success was an affirmation of that power in our community. The thing that was very disappointing was that an almost immediate result was the government introducing legislation that would have limited what anybody could enjoy in the way of compensation for other cases. And to me, that threw into some question her initial success if the government was just going to find a way around it. Bill 26 was an initiative of the provincial government in the aftermath of Leilani's success to limit what anybody else could receive as compensation in similar circumstances. It was introduced on the 10th of March, 1998, and it was withdrawn by the government on the 11th of March, 1998, because there was just a firestorm of negative reaction to this. The government, if I remember the detail of it correctly, was going to invoke the notwithstanding clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to deal with this particular issue.
What is that clause?
That clause says that a provincial government can override the Charter of Rights and Freedoms if there is what they consider to be an overwhelming public good for the override. For the government to say that limiting the financial compensation of people who have been wrongly sterilized is justification for overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I mean, that's just astonishing to me. So, if we go back to Leilani's case, I was delighted that she mounted it, and I was delighted that she was successful, and I do consider it a landmark case. Almost immediately, I thought that its landmarkedness was compromised by the government introducing the legislation that they did. I was glad to see them withdraw it, but when they let it die on the order paper, I don't remember that any one of them ever said, we've been hit over the head with a sledgehammer by our public who have told us that what we are doing is morally wrong. I don't remember the government ever acknowledging that they were morally wrong to have introduced it. In 2014, we've got people who are still in the Legislative Assembly and were instrumental in introducing that bill into the Legislative Assembly 16 years ago. Yes, I think we're some distance from an apology for what was done. And you might ask, when we repealed the legislation in 1972, did we apologize? And the answer is clearly no, we did not. Rightly or wrongly, those weren't thought of or talked about in that day, and we didn't have the imagination to conclude that it would have been the right thing to do at that time. You know, we were a government that thought repealing the legislation and putting an end to it was sufficient, and maybe we should have made the apology in 1972. Apologies are very, very interesting these days in the context of politics. You find mostly that apologies are not outright apologies. They are one person's apology that you misunderstood what he intended to say or what he intended to do, but they're not an apology for having said wrongly, spoken wrongly, or for having done wrongly. Apologies are a recent political phenomenon. Since perhaps the early 80s, I'm not sure, when some government issued the first apology. But I'm quite taken with the idea because I think that as citizens, we need to remember that though the government changed its face in 1971 in Alberta, the government of Alberta is the same government on the 1st of September 1971 as it was on the 1st of July of 1971. The party that is operating the levers has changed, but as an institution, government is government. Okay? And citizens need to remember that when they vote for politicians in 1 year, they're going to live with the decisions of those politicians for years and years and years. And as citizens, they have to accept responsibility for the consequences of what those citizens have done. So, though apology is a fairly recent political phenomenon, I think that it's one that all of us should attend to. I'm a pretty active member of the United Church of Canada, and we have apologized to Indigenous peoples for our role in the residential schools experience. And I think we have really tried to make that a genuine apology, not only in the speaking of it when we did, but also thereafter in trying to amend our relationships with Indigenous peoples. So I believe that governments should do that. I believe that churches should do it. I believe that universities should do it. And I'd put the universities and the churches in the same boat, that they have considerable moral authority in the community. If they're functioning at all well, they have considerable moral authority. And if they have moral authority, they have moral responsibility as well. And so I think that it would be appropriate, and I think it would be powerful for the University of Alberta to admit its responsibility as an academic seedbed for a line of thought that was wrong. I'm always surprised, a little surprised or very surprised at how much citizens do not know about the condition of their community, including the law and the history of it. It's been said more than once that history is written by victors, and somewhere that can be modified to say that history is written by those who are dominant in a community. It doesn't have to be the victor or the vanquished. Sometimes it's just the dominant versus the marginalized. And the true history of marginalized peoples is not much attended to in any of our history classes or in our conversation. Before I sat down to do this interview, I was chatting with a very bright university graduate who wanted to know what was the interview about. And when I told her that we had a Eugenics Board in Alberta and that we were sterilizing people as recently as 1972, she was absolutely flabbergasted. She not only did not know the particulars of it, but she couldn't believe in general that that kind of thing could happen in Canada. There are all kinds of things happening in Canada that many people would believe couldn't happen in Canada. I think this history matters to people because those who will not know history are condemned to repeat it. You can change the clothing on the issue. I mean, we've talked about an apology for people who were wrongly sexually sterilized. That leads us to the question about the apology to Indigenous peoples, or the apology to the Japanese Canadians who tried to be faithful citizens and were nonetheless interned. And the list of these things can go on and on. We can move it away from the question of apologies to the question of government decisions as a matter of budget or a matter of program or whatever else. You know, in Alberta right now, there's a shortage of hospital beds, okay? 16 years ago, the government blew up a hospital because there were too many hospital beds. We need to know our history, we need to attend to our history, we need to remember our history, because if we don't, we're going to repeat the same mistakes in slightly different conditions, in a somewhat different place. Why would we do that?